Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Azure podcast. I'm your host, Evan Baslick. All the rest of the co-hosts are off. I don't know, maybe they found warmer climates. This week, it's sort of cold and rainy down my way. This is episode number 512, and we're going to talk about WARA, which actually one of my first questions is I actually don't remember what WARA stands for, so we'll ask Senth when he gets on. And recording this on January 27th in 2025. So a couple of announcements real quick before we get to Synth. So first, and these are all actually ones that, if you're using these, you should pay attention because the dates are coming up. But Azure RM, so, I've been doing it long enough when I remember when Azure RM was new, but Azure RM is reaching its retirement February 1st. And I'm actually not sure if the APIs will end up still working, but the PowerShell commandlet's certainly not supported at that point. TLS 1.1 continues to go away. Azure Automation will stop accepting connections for it in February. And then this one's not a retirement, but this is a cool feature. When we have storage outages, portions of the infrastructure at the storage layer, you have to wait for us to fail over. And so what we've added for ADLS and storage, if you're using the secure SFTP protocol, now you can trigger failover on your own. So if you don't want to wait for us to recover for whatever reason, and you're okay with whatever hasn't been replicated to the secondary location, you can certainly force that failover and bring your app up. Really good to think about, as you're looking at your disaster recovery plans, because we'll try and recover as fast as possible, but it's not always fast enough for any given workload. So on that, we'll get over to our special guest and our special topic today. So our guest today is Senthuran Sivananthan. Senth and I have been working, actually not this year, but last year we worked on some things together related to the architecture review work that we do within our Cloud Success, as well as that we publish on our content. Senth, let's, if you could introduce yourself and tell us what you do for Microsoft.
Yeah, happy to. Hey, everyone. I'm Senthuran Sivananthan. I'm a chief architect within Global Customer Success. That role essentially means I got two major functions. I work with a lot of our customers. We do a lot of architecture reviews. We talk about new workloads or new projects that they want to work on, and then we help them through the process there. But then I also work on some of the internal work programs as well, just to make sure that our teams globally are equipped to help the customers, right? So this way we can scale to as many customers as possible. So I get dual function. Yeah, it's been a fun ride.
It is, and you and I mostly got to hang out on when things are broken. Although, we got to hang out on a project where we were actually telling customers some, about our platform. But really, for the purposes of this conversation, we're really focused on your architecture stuff. So when we talk architecture, help me understand sort of what that means.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a few ways we look at architecture, right? And so the first one is sort of a logical view of all the different components and systems that needs to come together to make an application function so that it can do a business function for your customers, right? So, so a logical architecture is sort of that left to right view of how data flows, how the systems communicate. So we look at that, and then we also then go a little bit lower level and look at how do those get deployed? What type of
so like infrastructure at that point.
Yeah,
when you're talking
the infrastructure,
about that. Yeah.
exactly, right? So we look at VMs to PaaS services and try to find that right mix so that it works for the customers. And like you said, right? We're looking at things like, retirement, making sure the customer's on a set of SKUs that aren't going to be retired,
Mm-hmm.
or, notifications went out. We're helping them figure out availability zones and making sure that, workloads are actually using the availability zones in one or more regions. So those are all things we plan as part of that architecture conversation with customers. And the hope is that once they have that blueprint, they can then roll that into their dev environment all the way to production environment using some kind of automation tool, right? Whether that is Bicep or Terraform, we help out there as well to actually stamp out those environments.
And I mean, you mentioned it, you're working with customers, but the reality is there's not enough you or even of, the rest of your teams to go around for everybody. So how do you sort of help the broader customer base? Is this funneling things into design? Is this funneling things into best practices? Like y'all play in
Yeah.
that area as well, right?
Yeah, we do, right? And it actually, I mean, we want to scale through our cloud architects at Microsoft, but we also
Hmm.
want to make sure that information is widely available in our docs, right? And so when we find a proven practice that's been tested out with multiple customers and we're seeing success in that, we definitely put them into our internal documents so that it goes out to as many cloud solution architects as possible. But then we also translate them into our cloud adoption framework as well as well architected framework, so that information and that knowledge goes there, right? And by making that available there, we can sell, we can allow each of our customers to self-serve. The reality is we can't be in every place,
Yeah,
right? So if
right.
we're able to like help every single person know where it is, then at least they'll have a pointer to start from. And if they've got more questions, they can definitely reach out to their counterparts at Microsoft, and we're happy to help.
It is you actually, I think you actually said the words in there. So we've got sort of two flavors of this. There's the well architected review, which I think is where the WARA term comes
Yeah.
from, and then the WAF, which is the well architected framework. What's the difference between those two, and then how do they come together?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, well-architected framework has actually 5 different pillars that you want to look at your workloads, right? It has reliability, security, cost optimization, operational
Oh,
excellence,
it's a
and
test for Monday
performance.
morning to see if you could
It's a
list them
much,
all off the top of your
yeah, I
head.
got it, I think. Right? I think I got it. So yeah, I mean, there's 5 pillars in them, and the idea is to look at your workloads across all as many of those pillars as they make sense for your
Mhm.
application, right? So sometimes you're looking at it through the lens of cost optimization because you want to reduce that cost so that you can take the savings for another application that you want to work toward, right?
Mm.
Sometimes you're looking at it from the performance efficiency point of view because you want to make sure, hey, I've got, there is going to be an influx, right? Tax season's coming, so if you've got
Yeah.
applications related to tax, right, you want to look at how performant is it. You want to look at it from the context of reliability, right, WARA, and make sure that the workloads can actually scale, right, at the same time be performant and secure. So these are all sort of ways to look at it, and so these 5 pillars gives you sort of laneways or runways to look through it. Now, how WARA or well architected reliability assessment
Okay.
comes into play is that it is an assessment focused on the reliability pillar of well architected
Okay,
framework.
so you're taking so out of the five, you're sort of narrowing in on the reliability
You
piece
got
because
it.
that's that and this is actually where you and I first met, but that's actually where our customers and sort of struggle the most, right? Because
Yeah.
it requires some knowledge about how the platform works, how it breaks to decide sort
Yep.
of what are the best reliability approaches.
Yeah. I mean, when I think about when we deployed in data centers, right, that we
Yeah,
we would have owned, right, when I was in my other places, uh, we gold plated quite a bit, right? We
yeah,
gold plated the hardware. We tried to gold plate as
super
much of
expensive
the
everything.
the,
Yeah.
the tech stack all the way up. And then when you come to and then as a developer, and that was my background, is that I focus on the application, build the application as best as possible, log it, trace it,
Hmm.
deploy it, and then
Hmm.
it becomes someone else's responsibility to care and manage it, right? In cloud, the modality is different because um, as a developer, you're still doing the primary job of developing code and getting that to production, but you also have to think about how is that code going to be deployed because it's no longer the gold plated infrastructure, right? You're able to
Right.
mix and match IaaS or infrastructure as service and PaaS. So you want to have a good perspective across the tech stack now. And so that's where I think a lot of folks struggle, just to connect all the pieces together.
How much of this, and this is going to get a little bit into sort of reliability in general, more than just
Yeah.
WARA, but there's sort of a blend of capabilities that the platform brings on its own. So, app services is
Yeah.
itself deployed in its its own redundant fashion. But then there's other services like, although I think Redis has actually changed this behavior, but it used to be that Redis you sort of had to opt into a zone
Mhm.
redundant. behavior.
Yeah.
How do, what's the right way for customers to think about where do they take advantage of the platform capability versus where do they have to opt into some higher level of resiliency based on their application? How do they think through that?
Yeah. And so my recommendation always, and this is how I help the customers see through it, is
Hmm.
when there is availability zones available in the region that they've
Hmm.
picked, default to that automatically,
Just
right?
use
That
it.
should
Just
be
use it.
just use it, right? You like VNets, for example, spans AZ, so it's not that you're going to be spending more money by having the ability to use availability zones.
Right.
Now, the
Right.
caveat is there is a round trip latency even the zones, right?
Hmm.
And so what you want to make sure, and some applications like SAP are highly sensitive to some of that round trip
Hmm.
latency, or even SQL workloads, right? Depending on the
Yeah, if they're super
transaction
chatty.
throughput.
Yeah, if they're
Exactly.
super chatty. Yeah.
So you have AZs to use, and that's your default stance. Now you put the lens of the workload, right?
Hmm.
By using the AZs, are you going to penalize yourself elsewhere, like performance, right?
Hmm.
And so those are the pieces to look through, and it's an application by application evaluation to make sure. Right? That's one sort of
But
lens
it
to look
sounds like
at it.
you're saying start with
Yeah,
zone availability zones and then back off where you need to because of some very specific application thing versus
exactly.
historically people have started with I'm going to deploy it, I'm not going to leverage zones, then I'm going to try and, sort of get them in after the fact. And,
That's right.
that's sort of the wrong way to approach that or less optimal way to
Exactly.
approach it.
Exactly, right? And we all know that when we as we follow the safe deployment practices, right? And so
Hmm.
when we roll out changes across these AZs, we roll those changes sequentially, right?
Yeah.
Because we
Yeah.
know that customers are deploying their application, a front end or even a database across the 2 or 3 zones. So taking an incident that takes down more than one zone causes a big disruption to
Yeah.
customers, right? And so we will
Yeah.
definitely be rolling changes sequentially. And so by using AZs, they get that platform benefit of how we manage change as we get that across all the regions.
Okay, great. Now, so we talked about sort of the infrastructure layer. Do y'all play
Yeah.
at the application code layer as well? Like, hey, you should
Yes.
have
Yeah.
retry logic, or here's the best practice security design. Like, do you play at that level as well?
Yeah. Yeah. And before we get to that application level, the middle layer also is, I think, very important. Is PaaS services, a platform as a service.
Ah, yeah,
Uh, all those PaaS services, because what we are working towards, and not and I say working towards because not all Azure regions have availability zones, right? And
right,
so
right.
we're always going to be in that mixed mode for a while. But the idea is PaaS services will come with AZs, right? And so again, it's the same
So you get it.
concept,
You
right?
sort of get it for free at that point. Plus you don't have all the management of an infrastructure
Exactly,
service. Yeah.
exactly. But it's the same question, right? So I was working with a customer who's using SQL managed instances, right? And it's
Hmm.
a very complex, chatty application, which meant lots of transactions to the database. They couldn't use AZs because AZs actually increase the latency of the
Yeah.
commits,
Yeah.
right? And these have to be synchronous commits for the database, and therefore they evaluated it and then they backed out to a single zone regional deployment because that's the thing that
Yeah.
made sense for them, right?
Yeah.
And so
They probably
so
they
what?
probably do they end up doing like it's some sort of active passive model where
Yes.
they have a separate SQL deployment, but they fail the entire app
You
over at
got it.
that point. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
So what they decide to do in their case is they do multi-region, right?
Ah,
And so
okay. Okay.
they asynchronously replicate their database to the other region, and then if there's any incidents with that database, they have a recovery path to get out, right? And
Yeah.
they've tested
Okay.
those paths a whole bunch of times to make sure
That,
that it
that
works really, really
that's
well.
the key piece is all
Yeah,
all this stuff you got to test it, right? Because if you don't test it,
exactly.
who knows if it's actually going to work for you when it kicks in.
Exactly, right? And so, yeah, testing is, I would say, above and beyond the most important thing. And it's not
Yeah, for sure.
test once for the, I guess, checkbox. Hey, we've done it before we went to production, but it's like test often, as often as you can, and sometimes fail out of one region and run your application in the
Yeah.
other region for a bit, and
Yeah.
make sure there aren't any gremlins, hiding behind because there's a configuration drift somewhere that you didn't
Yep.
catch, right? And so yeah, test often, see if you can run out of your secondary region. If they need to be active passive, ideally, if you can and you have workloads, try to run them active active so you don't have to worry about DR,
Yeah.
but that
Yeah.
your application is able to handle that more gracefully. And then, Evan, to your question about application is critical, right? Like we went from gold plating things, right, all the
Yeah.
way from hardware
Yeah.
to the software stack. Now we have to think about, because we are composing more systems, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So every communication from the application code to another system, we got to make sure there's retry policies. We're managing the throttling, right? So
Yep.
the famous
Yep.
429s get thrown at
Yeah.
you. You have
Yep.
to know how to handle those. Um, you got to use queuing, right, to decouple your business logic, your application business
Mm-hmm.
logic from another system you may not even have control or purview into, right? So absolutely, there's cloud design patterns. There's a bunch of them, like 30, 40 patterns, right? Not all of them are relevant for every app, but definitely put those in play, because I think that gives you the ability to run your application gracefully, right? And I'll
Yeah.
give you a quick example.
Yeah.
E-commerce, right?
Mm-hmm.
You probably want your cart experience to be as resilient as possible, but maybe
Yes.
not the recommendations, right?
Yeah.
Because there's one thing that makes you a lot of money, and there's the other thing that will drive more into the
Yeah.
cart, but then the customer has to decide. So, you can still run an application, even parts of the application is degraded or down, right?
Yeah.
Because your
Yeah.
primary workflows, the money makers essentially are running as reliable as possible. So those application patterns play a role here.
And I think that gets into, I was going to ask you about, when you talk about those five pillars, it feels like some of those are in direct conflict with each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm running the, cheapest possible configuration, I'm probably not, at the resiliency that I want it to
Yeah,
be for my application. But it sounds like what you're just talking about there is that is how you make the balance is instead of picking at the application layer, maybe you pick at the component layer within the application
yeah,
and say, hey, this piece I can run sort of a cheaper configuration, but I'm okay if that goes down. This
yeah.
piece, my cart experience, and the one you're talking about, like that can't go down. That always has to work. So I'm going to design it and scale it and whatnot differently.
Exactly. Spot on, right? And so it's not a one size fit all for the
Yeah,
entire application.
yeah,
So it's definitely, it's very helpful to break it apart. And what I suggest is do what's called failure mode analysis, right?
okay,
Essentially, it's a what if exercise.
yeah,
What if I turn off that service, right?
hmm
Or what if I have a failure in the application, right? It's not always as an infrastructure or a PaaS outage, right?
yeah,
There could be a
yeah,
bug in the application that
hmm
caused a failure too. And so go through a set of failure mode analysis, essentially a what ifs.
hmm
Right? Once you know what your what ifs are, um, I'll give you, I'll plug it in, right? We have the Chaos Studio, and you can use Chaos Studio to simulate those failure mode analysis to give it a shot and see how does your application react, right? Do you have an immediate outage? Do you get a server error? So immediately when one tertiary component is impacted or not, right? And then based on that, prioritize the workflows
hmm
and then start adding resiliency, right? That doesn't mean you have to spend a lot of money. It could be
yep,
code changes, adding
yep.
retries, caches, etc. But that gets you further down, right? And you do this incrementally, right? Do the
But,
analysis and
yeah.
then do it again in a bit.
And that was the other piece I was going to ask is, some of this stuff, going from a SKU enabled to or I'm sorry, an availability zone enabled to a non-availability zone enabled, say Redis cache, might
Mm-hmm.
not be something that the application has to care about. But when
Yeah.
you talk about adding retry or even adding a caching layer, right? That's application designs.
Yes.
And while everybody likes to talk about the ideal world of, hey, I'm building something from scratch, so I'm going to build it, sort of the best way. In practice, that rarely happens, right? Almost everybody is dealing with existing workloads that you're trying
Yeah.
to boot. So how do you take that, how do you start walking that path from what I have today, which in a lot of cases is probably lift and shift, which
Yeah,
really
yeah,
doesn't do great. I mean, it'll run, but it's probably not going to run the way you want. How do you take that? How do you start that path or that journey
yeah.
from a lift and shift to something that actually is going to, be stable and run the way that you want it to in the cloud?
Um, a lot of road mapping with customers, right? And so I remember
Yeah.
this,
Okay.
as you talk about this, I remember a case we did this with a fintech
Hmm.
a few years back, and they had a application that was making loads of revenue for that
Hmm.
company. Um, legacy, classic ASP, ASP.NET.
Oh
They had
God, ASP. I haven't thought about ASP in
ASP. You
years.
you got it, you got it right. Um, massive SQL Server, lots of, and it worked fantastic for on-prem. But when we
Yeah.
start talking about modernizing into cloud, right? One of the things we have to look at is, with the application, or what we did was, all right, what are the things that you want to achieve in cloud? What do you want,
Hmm.
right? What is the,
Why'd you
and
go?
have that
Yeah.
sort of heart-to-heart conversation,
Yeah.
really, and like, what are you trying to achieve here? And they talked about the cost of running big databases, and then the risk of having one of those databases go down, and the impact
Hmm.
it could have to customers, right?
Hmm.
Because the blast radius becomes big,
Yeah.
right? And so we talked about that. We talked about, okay, what other new business they wanted to add. So they wanted to add some reporting and analytics and analysis. I'm like, okay, fantastic. So what we did was we came up with a laundry list of likes to have. We
Hmm.
prioritized them. And then we started with the application layer. They had to make some changes in the databases and the app, like time zone, right?
Hmm.
Can't use the time zone of your server. You got to use the time. You got to use UTC. That's a
Yep.
big
Yep.
change,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And so we did, well, because we did that road mapping work. We knew what the change we had to do, and then we knew what the risks were, because we can talk
Yeah.
to the app devs, like, hey,
Hmm.
how do you do a time zone? We use the server time. Well, we got to change them, right?
Yeah.
What type of
Yeah.
correlations do you use? Like, how do you, like? And so we did that, and then that roadmap really helped that customer um, just get into that headspace about modernizing. And you
Yeah.
don't modernize everything on the day one of production.
Yeah.
We did a lift and shift, but we modernized the databases, for example. And then
Hmm.
over the period of a year, they started to slowly cut into their technical debt, and then cut those out, and then move more and more into paths. I believe they still have classic ASP running somewhere in there, because it's probably one of those flows that doesn't get used often,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's like
It's just
back
not worth
end.
it's just not worth changing. Yeah.
Exactly, right. It runs an ETL process or some kind of an
Yeah.
extraction. Let it run. It's okay, right?
Yeah.
But if you get an opportunity because you're trying to do something more different, right? More fancy, or more specialized. Yeah, that's the opportunity to refactor that into something more
I,
modern.
I, I think you hit on something right there that as somebody who lives in the support world, that is one of my pet peeves, right? Like you don't upgrade or change your code just to upgrade it and change it, right? Because
Yeah,
this new shiny, new shiny library or new shiny language that's out there, you don't want to run around and upgrade just to that, because all you're doing is you're introducing bugs that,
yeah,
again, eventually you might get better because of that. But there's a pain period it takes whenever you make
yeah.
changes or migration, because we're humans and software has bugs in it. But you sort of pick and choose the pieces that you need to do. And if this part doesn't need it, just let it go. I mean, yeah, there's some support, challenges because
Oil,
nobody remembers
yeah.
the framework or whatever the case may be, but you're sort of not walking yourself into problems at that point.
No, exactly. Yeah. And when you build something new, that's also the opportunity, right? To say, okay, you
Yeah.
know what? I'm
Yeah.
building a new feature. I'm going to pick what's relevant today, right? And
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
reduce that technical toil. The other lens also to look at is this if, let's say I got some code that's been legacy for 5, 10 years,
Yeah.
but it has regular outage, right? It
Hmm.
always needs somebody to go reboot it every couple
Yeah.
of days, right? Because and
Yeah.
it's a well-known thing, and there's a standard operating procedure
Yeah.
for it. It's
Yeah.
probably an opportunity to fix it, because that's actually adding human toil, right?
Yep.
You need
Yep.
somebody else to remember to do this, and if they're not available, then you've got different problems, right? And
Yep.
so
Yep.
again, sometimes it's not technical, sometimes it's non-technical, like toil,
Yep.
that
Yep.
drives change, and then that becomes the other opportunity.
Great. Yeah, no, well, this is great. So, as we wrap up, any last things about, the well architected resilience review or the well
Yeah.
architected framework that maybe we didn't hit on that you want to leave the audience
Uh,
with?
yeah, a couple of things I'll leave it with, and I think these are critical to frame yourself in terms of how to run the analysis. You can always reach out to Microsoft for help, but I want to make sure that where you're able to self-serve, right, and be able
Yep.
to rationalize
Yep.
this among yourselves. So I think the first thing is non-functional requirements. Got to know your RPO, all right, recovery point objectives, RTO, recovery time objectives, your service level objectives, um,
Yep.
and
Yep.
how long can your business take to recover, right? Which is the mean time to recovery, right?
Hmm.
Those are all very important things to figure out first. Not every application is going to have the same
Yeah.
non-functional
Yeah,
requirements.
exactly.
So know what they are, group them, right? Call them critical, non-critical, right? To
Hmm.
make it simple here.
Hmm.
But come up with those classifications, because what that allows you to do is take every application, put them into the bucket first,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then once you have those buckets figured out, what we then do is do a bunch of analysis around. We talked about failure mode analysis, zonal analysis, like what if a zone goes down? What happens to the application?
Hmm.
Right.
Hmm.
So look into those. What if a region goes down? What happens to your application? How do you fail out?
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And then also, and a critical one, is look at the outages that has impacted your application in the past 3 months, 6 months,
Hmm.
9 months. And that doesn't mean just Azure
I was
outages,
gonna say that's
but
application level stuff as
that
well, I would assume.
application as
Yeah.
well. Exactly, right? Look at it sort of holistically. Oh yeah, we've had these many outages, and some of them were caused by the application, some of them were caused by the platform,
Hmm.
because that's going to give you an idea of where to prioritize, right?
Yeah.
And then once you have that prioritization, I would say pick one scenario, right? One component, do the WARA and well architected resiliency assessment, reliability assessments rather, and then from there keep going forward, right? So I
Yep.
think that's the best thing you can do. And the last thing I will say is don't forget your shared services, right? There's the firewalls, the DNS,
Yeah.
the identity,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
They
Yep.
are essentially the connective tissue between your application and the rest of the world, right? Whether the world is internal or to the customer. So make sure you're also doing the analysis of those shared services with your teams.
Yeah, great. No, awesome. Well, we'll definitely, when we publish the show, we'll include some links to the
Yeah.
public facing content for everybody to check out. Well, this is great, Sent. Good to talk to you, good to catch up, and I will try and keep WARA in my head. I know it's resiliency related or reliability, resiliency or reliability?
Reliability.
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 Okay.
There you go.
I did a big search when you and I started the project on some of that
Yeah.
internal content. I did a big search trying to figure out if reliability and resiliency are different.
Yeah.
I, in practice, they get used almost interchangeably. It's really, yeah,
Interchangeably. Yeah. It's all about how you're going to react to an outage, right? And how
yeah,
fast. So
exactly. Awesome. Well, great. Well, Seth,
yeah,
good to catch up with you again.
you bet.
Like I said, we'll get some links, and we'll go from there. Great.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.
See you
Catch you
later.
later.
Bye.
Bye.